So, welcome to this UCL Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy. My name's Fergus Green. I'll be your chair this evening. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Science, the co-convener of this Policy and Practice series, and I also co-lead our Climate Politics Research Cluster, which has helped with the organisation of tonight's event. So the title of tonight's seminar is What Would a Sustainable Global Financial System Look Like? And the question, of course, assumes that the current global financial system is unsustainable. Now, being at a university, we might want to interrogate that and unpack that, but one sort of proxy way we might think about, or at least I might think about the unsustainability of the current financial system, is to think that if the current financial system, couldn't really be sustained in a world of catastrophic, runaway, irreversible global heating. And yet that very financial system is fueling the destruction of the planetary life support systems on which it depends. One indication of that is, according to the International Energy Agency, in 2023, the world is on track to invest more than $1 trillion in the fossil fuel sector, and that's in keeping with the average, more or less, over the last 10 years, every year. $1 trillion going into fossil fuels. We might also think of it in terms of where the capital is not flowing, or at least not flowing in sufficient quantities. It's been estimated that $125 trillion of investment globally is needed between now and 2050 to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and to say nothing of the investments that are needed to tackle other ecological crises and to provide the social investment needed for a just transition. So the task that we've given our expert panellists tonight is to outline their vision for what a sustainable global financial system would look like. So to discuss this topic, we're joined by three excellent speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking, the rough logic being perspectives from asset managers, institutional investor, and then government. So our first speaker will be Tom Taylor. Tom is the head of climate finance at Aviva Investors, where he leads advocacy with policymakers and regulators on climate change and finance. He supports Aviva's work, the work of Aviva Investors and the wider Aviva Group on sustainable finance, with a particular focus on market and regulatory reform. And he's involved in Aviva's relationships with various UN, EU, and UK sustainable finance initiatives. Tom is a qualified solicitor and has previously held various roles in the public and private sector, in the legal sector. Our second speaker will be Dr. Ellen Quigley, to my immediate left. Ellen has various positions at Cambridge University. She is a principal research associate, the co-director of finance for environmental and social systemic change, and the special advisor responsible investment to the chief financial officer at Cambridge. Her work centres on the mitigation of climate change and inequality through the investment policies and practices of institutional investors, and she's a world-renowned expert on the notion of universal ownership, for which she has written a prize-winning paper. And our third speaker is Anne Pettifor. She is a political economist, author and public speaker, and an expert on the global financial and economic system. She's the author of multiple books, including The Case for a Green New Deal, which she has with her there, which I'm pleased to say I've read and can thoroughly endorse. She co-founded the UK Green New Deal group back in 2008, which advocates practical plans for tackling the interlinked crises of inequality and climate breakdown. And it's also the director of PRIME, Policy Research in Macroeconomics, a network of economists that promote John Maynard Keynes' monetary theory and policies, and that focus on the role of the finance sector in the economy. They will each speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll give them a 1-minute warning at the 6-minute mark. And then we'll have a panel discussion. I'll probably ask them a few follow-up questions, and then finally we'll open the floor to audience questions. So do prepare your questions as they're speaking. A final note before I hand over to our first speaker: the whole session, including the Q&A, will be recorded and posted online on the department's website, YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So if you speak, you will be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you won't. We'll let you know when the recording is available, and we hope that you might want to share it with others. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Tom Taylor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fergus, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be addressing you all. I was worried, actually, in Fergus's introduction, he was going to go through all these metrics by which our current financial system is not sustainable, and I wouldn't have anything sort of left to say. But I agree. The short answer, in terms of, before we get on to what a sustainable financial system might look like, is that the current one is not. So we use, depending on, there are various measures, but we probably use about 1.7 planets worth of resources every year. And you don't have to be brilliant at maths to work out that if you're using 1.7 planets worth of resources in terms of what can be replenished by the planet, it's not going to take you too long before you don't have anything left. And there are other, being in asset management, there are other metrics looking at global financial markets and where they're heading, and they're telling a very similar story. So if you look at a proxy for global equity markets, so the shares of global companies, MSCI there, All Countries World Index, is heading by the end of the century, by their analysis, for somewhere between 2.5 and 2.7 degrees of warming. And as Fergus says, at that level, we are highly likely to trigger tipping points that lead to runaway climate change, which means that we end up with much higher degrees of warming. And at that much higher level of warming in the world, our current global financial system very likely won't work. One of the reasons for that, as an asset manager of a group that includes insurance, is that it's very likely the insurance business model won't work. So if you want to do pretty much anything in the global financial system, but particularly in the developed world, you need insurance. If you want to build a bridge, if you want to build a road, if you want to do anything involving infrastructure, it will need to be insured. If you want to run a business, you will need public liability insurance, probably employer's liability insurance. If you want to move anything around the world, the trade agreements and the contractual terms between parties will involve insurance, because no one wants to be holding the baby when a cargo gets lost at sea or in the air or whatever it may be. And in an increasingly risky world from climate effects, although the actuaries who analyse insurance-related risk might be able to work out what the risk is, a couple of things might happen. One, and we're seeing this in certain parts of the world already, in Australia, in New South Wales, in California, insurers just don't have commercial appetite to underwrite risks that they think are highly likely to happen. So in California, wildfire risk is causing the state's biggest private insurers to withdraw cover. They don't want to insure houses anymore because they're worried they're going to burn down. Or the price at which that insurance becomes available will be so high that no one will be able to afford it. And if you don't have insurance, then you can't get a mortgage. If you can't get a mortgage, then the banking system starts to seize up. We saw that in 2008. And if insurance ceases to function, the banking system, the asset management system, that sort of form a three-legged stool around which the global financial system is based, will very quickly fall over. So, in short, the current global financial system, not sustainable. And as Fergus said, not just from a climate point of view, depending on where you are in the world, the global financial system might look very different and very inaccessible. So in terms of inequality as well, there is a huge problem that the financial system is not serving all citizens of the world equally. But it's also really important to realise that the global financial system is a human construct. We have built this global financial system. Mm-hmm. There is nothing written in the stars that says the system has to be this way. And therefore, humans can create something different. And really, the question is, will we create something different in time so that the ingenuity and the capital allocation power of the financial system can help solve the sustainability crises that we've created? Or will it change too late, or possibly not at all? And that is a huge question, because, I mean, Fergus, you were talking about the huge amount of money that's needed for the transition to to net zero. So in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, the 197 parties to the Paris Agreement all agreed that we need $4 to $6 trillion a year until 2050 to finance the investment that we need to change the energy and other systems that the world depends on. And that is just an enormous amount of money. It's virtually impossible to imagine how much money that is. I mean, if you put it into time, 1 million seconds is about 12 days, 1 billion seconds is 32 years, and 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. And 32,000 years ago, well, we weren't worrying about global financial systems, we were worrying about kind of how we were going to make fire and various other things. So it's extraordinary amounts of money. But because we could imagine a different financial system, we've got to have hope that it's possible. And if we actually harness the power of the global financial system, then we can finance things that help us rather than the things that are actually causing the problems that, again, as Fergus said in his introduction, we continue despite the scientific evidence, despite the pleas from the UN Secretary General, from the Pope, from children striking from school, from all sorts of corners. Despite those pleas, we continue to finance the things that are causing the problems. And yes, we can see solutions coming through, but still far too much money is flowing in the wrong direction. More money, in fact, than is flowing to the solutions. So how do we get there? Well, I think that we have to use the system that we've got and evolve the system that we've got to create this new financial system. We have to make sure that voices from around the world have a turn in shaping what the world looks like. At the moment, the global financial system is largely influenced by the G20, so the 20 biggest economies, and now becoming the G21 with the African Union joining. Because they control most of the governance of the global financial system. But actually that means that they should be thinking about how they can change that governance to take account of the fact that all the countries around the world have signed up to the ideas of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Kunming-Montreal Protocol on Biodiversity, all these things. How do you then think about what you've done before and how you have to do it differently to create a more sustainable system? And the signals that they send will flow down to the likes of us, because we're highly regulated, to the asset owners, and governments have a huge role because ultimately they control those institutions.
Thank you very much. Go on quickly.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up right where you left off around the role of government. But first, I want to lay out a couple of things. I mean, things are as bad as we've just been discussing. People are referring to our era as one of the poly-crisis now because it recognizes this interplay between and among climate change, biodiversity loss, inequality, pandemic risk, and all these other things, and how there are interactions, there are ways in which each of those risks can increase the severity of the others. So we're in a very strange time. But the other thing that's interesting about where we sit in time and space is that there is a lot of support for doing something about these things. There is strong global consensus. You can see this in surveys of the beneficiaries of the pension funds that I work with. You can see this in public opinion polls, and you can see this even in the negotiations around the Sustainable Development Goals, right? That's a lot of countries to get behind particular goals. So there is strong consensus that we need to do something about these issues. So I guess the question is, why are we not doing anything? Emissions are still going up, and in fact, a majority of emissions that have ever been emitted have been emitted in the kind of post-Friedman era, the last 40 years-ish. And things are again going in the wrong direction, and I think that some of the adjustments we need to make both materially and cognitively have to do with countering some of the assumptions that have become really embedded in our thinking and actions in the past 40 years. So if I think about what a sustainable system looks like or could look like, obviously it's a lot of things, and as with, I mean, these are complex problems, there's never going to be one or two things that could possibly solve all of these issues, but I would say there are two really key components in what we could eventually see making a dent in our current challenges. One is, frankly, the role of government. I think in this era, we have forgotten that, in fact, there can and should be a strong role for regulation at the national level, but also supranational cooperation to get the kinds of coordinated actions that are the very reason that we have governments. And it does seem like we've kind of forgotten this. And the types of things that we expect from governments now tend to serve some of they tend to fit with the ideology that we've been inculcated in. So this is rather unacceptable to say, but I'm not as huge a fan of carbon taxation as many people are. Partly because over half of emissions are actually emitted by the top 10% of income earners, and they're going to be much less price sensitive than you'd think, and that's where we can most easily and where we most should be cutting emissions. And there's a lot of psychology around what happens if you make something more expensive when people actually can afford it, and it's maybe even starting, it could even begin to be viewed as a good that people are can use as kind of conspicuous consumption. I just think it's a lot more complicated than, you just put a price on carbon and call it a day. But it does fit with this kind of post-Friedman era that we've been living in. Whereas, some of the things that we've seen in the past few decades that have worked have been things like enacting fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. Just in, California and the EU alone, that's where you see the entire industry shifting. Commitments to end the sale of internal combustion engines by a certain date. Like, these are concrete things that result in the emission cuts that we want to see. But it's not a pricing mechanism. These are direct interventions to get us to where we need to go. I've been talking a lot about a book I read recently called 5 Times Faster, and it really helped crystallize some of my thinking in this regard. I think we spent a lot of time on metrics, trying to get some precision around things that we're then less likely to do something about. And we tend to like to think about emissions targets. So, blank percentage of emissions decreased by blank year is a pretty standard way of appearing to be willing to do something. Countries have these sorts of commitments. But those just tend to be missed. My own country of Canada has just missed every one of its commitments ever in this regard. And that's not uncommon. You see all sorts of commitments like this being missed. It's more common than not. I would say this is why it may be more useful to think of the things that we would need to do in order to get to those emissions reductions that are required. So instead of making up numbers, figuring out how we'll actually get there, and then enacting the legislation and regulation that would be required to do that. And then just to say, I work with pension funds, endowments, other asset owners. We term universal owners because they own a more or less representative slice of the whole economy. And what that does is that means that universal owners go down with the ship. If the overall market is not doing well because we have eroded the social and economic bases on which it rests, then you can't pay out your liabilities to your beneficiaries in 30 years. It's just impossible. So there's this growing recognition that our pension funds, our university endowments, and others need to actually contribute to decreasing systemic risks like climate change in the real world. And by doing that, they may be able to help even out some of the challenges that we see with jurisdictional pressures. So, my own country, again, Canada, has a lot of lobbying from the industries that probably should be regulated. And what asset owners can do is to help kind of level the playing field between and among jurisdictions to help reinforce sensible legislation for countries that may have reasons to be more reluctant to enact it. So those are just two of the things that I think could at least contribute to addressing the situation that we see now. I suppose just because I have a few more seconds, I'll add something else, which is that I think we need a greater variety of institutions in our financial system. We need more cooperatives and nonprofits because there's that variety actually used to be in many jurisdictions a little bit more more common, and then you don't have all of the entities in the financial system merely gunning for outperformance, for maximizing profit. You have some institutions that are there for the common good as well. And again, that helps support the health of the overall system on which all of us depend.
Thank you very much.
Right. So Fergus, sorry, I'm going to stand up because I can't talk if I'm sitting down, really. I need to stand up. So first of all, it's lovely that there's so much agreement on this panel around the key issue that there's a problem with the system and it needs to be reformed. I would argue it needs to be transformed. You didn't mention Fergus. I'm a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission. The Scottish Government doesn't have a central bank, so it has a lot of challenges it faces. It depends on the British government for grants and so on. But we are working in the actual practical business of how do you make a just transition? How do you persuade oil rig workers and their employers, the big oil companies in Aberdeen, to shift from that economy into a more sustainable economy by restructuring the economy itself and building more social infrastructure, not so much physical. These are some of the issues we're encountering on a day-to-day basis. So I'm very much in that space, and having to think really hard about the practical stuff. But the reason I'm here is that I sort of made my name because I predicted the global financial crisis. And I was amongst one of the very few that did. And I mean, it wasn't that I'm particularly clever or qualified or an academic. I did a simple thing. I was working in the field of sovereign debt. And all I did was I looked at the total global public and private debt relative to global income. And I came to the conclusion that actually that debt wasn't going to be repaid. And if it weren't going to be repaid, it was going to cause a major crisis. Now, in those days, in that time, before I published the book in 2005, it was published in September 2006, total public and private debt was about 200, a little bit over 200% of GDP. Today, it's up to $300 trillion, which is nearly 3 times global income, which is estimated between 80 and $100 trillion. So what we have is this overhang of debt. And it's not going to be repaid ultimately. And something will trigger the crisis, and we don't know what it was. My big weaknesses was that I couldn't predict exactly when it was going to blow up, really. And I couldn't work out what it was that would do that. But because the system is so unbalanced and unstable, you know that it's subject to a trigger. And that trigger could be climate, it could be social unrest, it could be all kinds of things. So the thing I learned most from that experience was that I spent a lot of time trying to understand the international financial system. Can I just say that the biggest problem we have with the international financial system is that it's governed by private authority. Governments effectively don't have any say on really key levers of the global economy. Capital mobility, cross-border capital mobility, the setting of interest rates really responds largely to capital markets, exchange rates and so on, and whether or not companies will invest. Companies like Aviva, will you invest in helping Scotland make the transition from oil to a more sustainable economy, which requires us to invest in all kinds of things, including the retrofitting of housing, for example. And markets decide according to their own interests on what they're going to do. And it's private interests that they're overwhelmingly concerned with. Now, the thing is, what needs to happen for me is we need a great transformation. Karl Polanyi was famous for his book, The Great Transformation. I'm going to argue we need another great transformation. But that's going to be really hard to do it because it requires subordinating those private markets to the public interest, to the interest of the public, of the wider public, if you like, not just the public sector, but of the people. And to subordinate those powerful institutions to the interests of the nation, of governments, is going to be extraordinarily difficult. Right now, in my estimation, the global economy is governed by Wall Street. Wall Street decides on all kinds of things, on levels of investment, where they're going to invest, how they're going to invest it. And Wall Street is governed by private authority, but backed by public authority. There's not a single bank on Wall Street that is allowed to fail. All the banks are now too big to fail, and no government, certainly not the United States, is going to allow a Wall Street bank to fail. So in fact, these private institutions are backed by public authority and public, basically by taxpayers, to put it crudely. So we're in this dilemma about how we're going to shift that power balance. Now, I don't think that's going to be easy. They've put up a hell of a fight, and they're very powerful. They've actually bought, in the United States, I would argue that practically every congressman or woman has been bought in some way by Wall Street. It's really hard for elected representatives to challenge the power of Wall Street in Washington. So, the system has been partly corrupted by these interests. And so I don't see that governments, in particular the United States, which of course would be a leading government for reform, is going to do what, for example, Roosevelt did in 1933 when his Treasury Secretary argued that they'd moved the government from Wall Street to Morgenthau's office in the Treasury in Washington. I don't think we've got leaders that are going to be able to do that this time. But the other point to make is this, that there's been a global, worldwide revolt against the system. We've seen uprisings across the world in all kinds of places. And those revolts have been pretty unsuccessful. But the thing that really frightens me is that we've seen the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism. And again, I draw on Karl Polanyi in arguing this case, that when citizens find that they can't affect their government, they can't influence their government to do, for example, something about inequality, to do something, for example, about falling wages in real terms, they get cross. When they lose the roof over their heads or their children are unable to buy a property to live in, a roof over their heads, people get mad as hell. When they lose their jobs, as they did in the Rust Belt, the United States, they get mad as hell. And they go after people like Donald Trump. And we've seen this happen not just in the United States, but in India, in China, in Russia, and even in countries in Europe. And this rise of nationalism, protectionism, and authoritarianism is an extraordinarily dangerous thing for global markets. So the question is, really, what I've tried to do in my book is to explain what kind of system we need, because what happened after 2007 was people stood around saying, oh, hell, we didn't know that could happen. We didn't know the system could collapse. So there was no alternative plan. There was no plan B. And in my view, the Green New Deal is a plan B, and I would like us to discuss it more and prepare more for what will happen when it is necessary to transform the system, or when a system is in a position to be transformed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will just ask a couple of questions probably of each of you. So the first general question I have, so you've all mentioned kind of, which was quite nice, you've all mentioned sort of slightly different aspects of sort of regulatory responses. And I just wanted to sort of ask each of you to maybe elaborate a little more on that. So Tom, you mentioned the importance of the G20 as government actors. And so I wonder if you could give some examples or an example of specifically the kind of things that you would like to see the G20 do as a group or sort of nationally. And then for Ellen, you mentioned at the end the importance of having different kinds of institutions, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, perhaps sort of the role of like state investment banks in particular, if that, or some other sort of specific proposals around alternative institutions. And then, Anne, you mentioned sort of the fact that Wall Street has effectively kind of corrupted the US government, and I wonder if they weren't so corrupted, if the US Congress were to regulate Wall Street, what kind of regulations would you suggest?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So we can go in the order of the speakers.
Yeah. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. So the G20 or the G21, if we're adding in the African Union, has an outsized role to play. I mean, it's 80% of global GDP. These are the developed economies, and responsibility to make these changes is going to have to be led by developed economies. And in terms of their power, in terms of regulating the system, and it does have to come down from the governments and into the institutions, but After 2008, they set up or evolved an existing institution into the Financial Stability Board. And looking at the stability of the financial system, and I was just saying in my first intervention that climate change in particular, but all these sustainability crises, are a threat to the stability of the financial system. Therefore, there is a mandate to act. Within the Financial Stability Board, you have the supervisors of the banking system under the Basel Committee, who set the rules about how much capital the banks have to hold against their liabilities. Similarly, for insurers, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, you have the regulators of financial markets, at IOSCO, the securities commissioners. And the signals that they send to national regulators are actually incredibly important and incredibly powerful because we have globalized markets, if you get fragmentation, and we do in places get fragmentation, then you create these market inefficiencies that can be exploited by big financial institutions. So the collective way in which they set some of the global governance is really important. And as I was saying, I think that those institutions should, in looking at their mandates, respond to the fact that those governments have set targets like the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, becoming modular. At the moment, they aren't really being factored in. I mean, last week, being fair to the World Bank, they did evolve their sort of their vision statement to say they weren't just looking at the eradication of poverty, they wanted it on a livable planet. So fair play to AJ Banga and that team. But like, they need to evolve their work to take account of the fact that all these governments are doing that. But one of the reasons that they're not is markets don't believe that governments have the stomach to implement those things. If they did, then valuations would be completely different. So what we actually need is we need the policy from governments that makes market believe. The sorts of examples actually that Ellen gave. So auto manufacturers believe that from 2030 or 2035, depending, and we won't get into that too much, they're not going to be able to sell, or they're going to have to pay a huge penalty to sell, which is still the case in the UK, £15,000 a car, £15,000 a car, internal combustion engine cars. So no one's developing internal combustion engines anymore. They're all working on EVs. So we need policy across the spectrum, transport, energy, built environment, food and agriculture, that markets will believe. And then regulating that comes down through the G20.
So I wish I'd gotten his question. So if it's okay, I'll maybe also answer that one a little bit. I just have really specific things that I think we should be insisting on from regulators and legislators right now. And the number one thing is power sector infrastructure, new coal and gas-fired power plants and biomass plants that are still being built. So the G20 has so many new gas plants that are being built right now, and that's the difference between any kind of reasonable temperature target and being nowhere near to meeting any of our goals. Like, that's the difference right there. So I would say, I mean, that's just number one on my list. That's wealthy countries. That's, you know, hundreds of new gas-fired power plants going up in rich countries all over the world. When we have alternatives that work and that are at a decent price point. I would also say I would rather, you know, rather than replace each vehicle with an EV version of itself so that we can each drive around in our private domains, I would prefer a lot of investment in public transport. And those two things alone, that handles just a huge chunk of our global emissions right there. Electricity and transport are just an enormous component of all this. But to slightly get at your question, it's not my area of expertise, so that's why I'm kind of avoiding it. But I would just say I'm from a place that has about half of its assets in credit unions. So it's a province in Canada called Saskatchewan, but it's got a lot of assets in credit unions. And when I talked to one of the heads of a credit union after the financial crisis, he talked about how they smoothed out their lending. So they were trying to lend counter-cyclically so that there wouldn't be the kinds of booms and busts. They said, look, we don't want in our communities lots of construction work and then all of those people to have no work, when we can simply smooth that out and have the housing and construction sectors, in particular, that was the main thing that he was referring to, much more sensibly allocated across time. So you know, that's the sort of thinking that I see in institutions that aren't mainly oriented around the whims of shareholders, to be frank about it.
I've forgotten the question.
Yeah, so I think So we've heard a lot about sort of the
Yeah.
energy sector and sort of the regulation of high carbon sectors, and that obviously that regulation can sort of shift capital flows. But what I think was interesting about your answer is that you were talking about the regulation of the financial sector as such and Wall Street. And so what kind of reforms to sort of the financial sector and Wall Street would you suggest?
So, well, first of all, I mean, and just in response to what Tom has said, you know, the BIS regulates the banks that are on our high streets, our main streets that we're in touch with, that, you know, that are banks. But that's not where finance is raised anymore, and that's not where money is made. Money is made in the shadow banking sector, as it's called, market-based finance. And some of the pension funds play the game very much, use the cash that they hold to exchange for collateral, to effectively act as banks to people who need cash. And that sector is vast. It's much bigger than the high street and the main street banks. And it's unregulated. That's it. And not just as it not unregulated, but is positively supported by the central banks, our central banks, regarded as absolutely essential to maintain the stability of those and the interests of those capital markets. Now, it was those capital markets that brought down the system in 2007-9 and again in March 2020. And the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the ECB generated trillions of dollars to bail out the sector. We didn't notice because we were all engrossed in COVID. So we've had two grave financial crises, and they both were triggered by the repo markets, by the shadow banking system. So that the point is, the system has actually been constructed to remove it from regulatory democratic oversight. That's its mission, right? I'm really glad we all agree on the need for regulatory democracy or democratic regulation. But the point is, the structure of the international financial system is actually to remove it, to make absolutely certain that no government will interfere and intervene in managing those markets. And that's, you know, so that has to change. Now, it'll change when they collapse again. And what annoyed me both about 2007-9 and March 2020, I wasn't against them being bailed out because an awful lot of pension funds in there. And these are, as you say, when the ship goes down, when the thing collapses, the ship goes down, and my pension fund ship goes down. So I'm in favour of the central bank bailing out. But it bails out unconditionally. There are no terms and conditions. I would have said, yeah, you can have the money, but we would like you to be more carefully regulated. Furthermore, we would like you to pay taxes here. And all of, you know, there are lots of conditions we could impose. We could say you can have access to the central bank's resources on condition that. But instead we say no. The taxpayer is very happy just to spew out resources to maintain the capital markets, almost unconditionally. So that's a really big problem that we face. Now, you know, the question is going to be, and of course, we completely all agree that these markets are driving fossil fuel emissions. Why? Well, first of all, fossil fuels are far more profitable than clean energy, right? Investing in wind and solar is just not profitable. And, you know, those markets might break down because they're so flawed. But it's immensely profitable to invest in fossil fuels. Now, why do they insist on investing on fossil fuels? Well, that's because they have to earn rates of return to pay our pensions in the future, but also to pay down the debts that they've borrowed, right? And those rates of return have got to be high enough to make it possible for them to meet their future obligations and liabilities. And so they will continue to do that so long as there's that imbalance in the system. So, you know, I'm not saying these are bad guys who are just deliberately bad. I'm saying they're driven by a system which requires them to make excessively high rates of return, and that requires them to extract more fossil fuels, to cut down more forests, to fish more seas, et cetera, in order to find the money they need to repay. Now, the reason we have this huge overhang of debt is because the management of the creation of credit is left to the market, so-called, to the invisible hand, right? In the old days, you know, banks, central banks and commercial banks used to be very careful before they allocated credit. Nowadays, the capital markets are not careful about credit when they create credit. If somebody says, can I have $3 trillion, please, because I want to go, or $44 billion because I want to go and buy Twitter, They say, oh, sure, yeah, here it is, $44 billion. They don't stop and say, are you going to be able to make enough money to repay that $44 billion? Are you really sure of this? Am I sure that you're capable? No, they say. Elon Musk is a good thing. He's made money elsewhere. He'll make money for us. So where is that $44 billion? And whose money is it? I think there are quite a few pension funds and asset management funds in there. And that's our money. That's our surpluses, our savings, et cetera, et cetera. So until we switch off the spigot of credit creation by the market, the invisible hand, and instead we regulate credit creation. Say, look, you can have some credit, but it's got to be invested in something sustainable, and above all, it's got to be invested in something that will generate the income needed to repay within the ecological limits that we face. So this is the point about, we can talk about what should happen, but for the G20 to do the right thing means they've got to do something about the shadow banking sector.
Okay, great. Now I'd like to bring the audience in now. How are we going to do this with will they use this? Or? Yeah. Yep, okay. So I suggest I'm going to take questions 3 at a time. So please raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question. Yep, so we'll take, to start with the gentleman in the blue top there. Yeah, so far I'm only seeing guys, so I'm going to... Oh, Donna. Yeah, so yeah, blue, then brown stripes, and then Donna. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Blue.
Go first. It's fine.
I wanted to ask about the debt and the sovereign debt. Given the...
I can't hear you.
Given the debt level
that
the UK faces or the European state face, how will they be able to pay the transition and increasingly over the years invest in the new technologies and in the just transition?
Yeah, okay.
Hello, thank you very much. Just to jump on regulating the shadow banking sector and with regards to the G20, what do you think of global financial, or what role can global financial regulation such as GFANS by Mark Carney, which was proposed I think in 2021 and as far as I have the impression is slowly crumbling down now, what role does this regulation play for the future?
So we briefly kind of touched on just transitions and kind of the inequalities that the global financial system faces when thinking about kind of climate change and all this kind of stuff. When thinking about kind of in just transitions, how we're looking at reinvestments into green industries like tech, et cetera, how does the global financial system kind of adapt itself to assist in these kind of like inequalities? We're trying to get people who are in fossil fuel industries into green industries. How does that reinvestment go? What is the global financial system kind of, how does that adapt to assist in this?
Okay, so maybe Andy, do you want to take the EU
debt
one?
question.
Maybe Tom the shadow banking one, and we'll start with
I
that.
take the debt question?
No, you don't need to. Sorry. Go
Yeah, so, this always comes back to what money is and what credit is and where it comes from. And money and credit is not savings, it's not existing pension funds. It's our ability to create new money, credit. And we do that through a monetary system, which ought to be sound. But the central point of the monetary system is we create credit in order to generate the income to repay the credit. So it's to be stable, it has to be a circular process. And a government which is backed by 30 million taxpayers, all of whom are obliged to pay their taxes by law, and that has a prospering economy, can generate enough tax revenues to enable it to create credit, large sums of credit. So when the Bank of England created £70 billion during the COVID crisis to help companies and so on, that's because the Bank of England is powerful because it's backed by people like you and me. And so what will happen, in the transition is that the Bank of England would certainly be able to raise finance. The question will really be is not so much the ability to raise the finance, even if you already have debt, and I don't want to get into austerity and the debt story, the public debt story, but the question is, how will that money be spent? In environmental terms, that's the really important question. Are you going to spend that money on activity which is going to accelerate emissions, or are you going to spend it on something that is quite different? And who's going to decide that? How is that going to be decided? Is it going to be the market, or is it going to be, in the sense, public authority? And for me, that's far more important, because if it's invested in sound activity, and in a green economy, that's largely going to be services and non-emitting type activity, then your ability to generate income and therefore tax revenues to help repay that borrowing is sustained. And the same applies to the private sector when they invest. So it's more about how that money is going to be spent. And the important thing, so for me, a sustainable green economy is going to be a labor-intensive economy. We're going to have to learn to grow our own food, make our own clothes. We're not going to be able to import stuff from Bangladesh and China and food from Kenya using up their water table and so on. And that will be labor-intensive activity. I'm hoping that we'll have more investment in social infrastructure, the arts, music, design, education, science, all of those things which are not in themselves sort of heavy emitters. And that's what the news... And the question is, but they will be labour intensive, and people who are employed earn incomes, pay tax revenues, and help to balance the borrowing. I hope that helps answer your question.
Yeah, so I mean, GFANZ isn't regulation or a regulatory. GFANZ is ultimately an umbrella institution, or it is an institution now pretty much, of financial institutions that made commitments to net zero, including us. And I think the real question is, what are they going to do to implement those pledges, right? And in a way, making the pledge is the easy bit, because the CEO isn't going to be around in 2050 or 2040 or whatever it is. So what we're seeing is now the evolution from making a pledge to issuing a transition plan. And when you've got a transition plan, that's not saying where are you going to be by 2050. It has to include, what are you doing this year? What are you doing by 2025, 2030, and so on. So that then brings it right back in to be a problem for the current CEO. And that's really important. So that's one element. What is your transition plan? What are you doing? And you report against it every year. And actually, we need transition plans everywhere to help govern the transition. People need to say what their contribution is going to be, not just financial institutions. The regulators should, the government should, because that will help us understand where the priorities are going to be. So that's one thing. The other thing about all those institutions, and as Anne's touched on and Ellen's touched on, in the vast majority of the cases, they're not dealing with their own money, it's our money. And actually, as more transparency about which institution is doing what, actually the role of the public is saying, well, actually, I want my pension fund to pick an asset manager who is actually doing something about this, rather than just the one who perhaps has the lowest fees, or even the one that delivers the best returns. Because if you ask most people, I mean, some people will say, yeah, I want the most money at all costs, right? But actually most people would say, well, yes, I want my money to grow, but not at any cost, right? And actually, lots of the questions around, my duty is to maximise returns as an asset manager, or maximise profit to shareholders. That's not true. Not at any cost. Like, we're an asset manager. If we were an asset manager and our only role was to maximise returns, then we'd deal drugs, we'd run guns, we'd rob banks. We don't do those things because they're prohibited by law. There is actually a big old framework around what we can and can't do. And if you complete the Milton Friedman quote, in terms of the business of business is to maximise profit for shareholders within the rules and norms prevailing at the time. So if we can change some of those norms, so that actually people are saying, I'm not asking you to make as much money as possible. I'm asking you to look after my money responsibly, to generate some, to increase it so I can have a retirement or whatever I'm saving for, but not at any cost. Not at the cost of my children or my grandchildren or other people over there. So that's a big mindset shift. But if you get that demand from everybody, then that will make a big difference.
So I would just say, to build off of that, I mean, that future has already come. I mean, when we survey beneficiaries of pension funds. That's what they say. But most of the solutions that they're being offered are not going to deliver the kinds of improvements to the system that, and maybe we can get into that if there's time. I just have like a tiny little comment on all three of your questions. So one is just to add to what Anne said. There's actually just a choice between doing the stuff that's necessary to avert catastrophic climate change or paying for the much larger costs of not doing so in the future. So as much as, we might wonder how we're going to pay for things and so on and so forth, I do think it's important to contrast, like those are our only two options. There's no magical third option in which we don't have costs.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Second, I'm so happy to be able to introduce some controversy to this panel, because I really think that GFANS is crap, and it's crap for the same reason that a lot of other entities in this space are crap. And it may be...
Do you want to say a little bit about what GFANS is?
Yeah, okay, right. So it's the Global Financial...
Alliance.
Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero.
Oh, right. That's the Carney one.
Exactly, the Carney one. And they've got, asset owners, asset managers, insurers, lawyers. I think the insurer one kind of fell apart. But the point is, it's all around portfolio decarbonization, which, by the way, hint, does not contribute to decarbonization of the real world. People mainly sell their shares and keep loading up the bonds that provide new money to fossil fuel companies and utilities that are still expanding fossil fuels. So I think that's not what we need. An example of the regulation that we might want, just to give a small example, would be listing rules that you can't list on the stock market if you are engaging in fossil fuel expansion. Simple, that's just one thing. Finally, just on tech and like how we're shifting money. I do think we need to think about this slightly differently in two different ways. One is, tech companies are actually contributing to misinformation and disinformation that is making it harder to solve all of these problems. And they also have big data centers and stuff like that. Like, I'm not sure it's straightforwardly true that tech is green and in fact might be causing problems in ways that we don't quite recognize. But I'll just say this, I was wrong about this for many, many years. I used to focus on the green stuff, increasing the green investment, which totally does need to happen. But what has happened is that we've seen an addition, not a transition. So we've seen green investment go up, but at the same time, fossil fuel investment has also gone up. So now I just focus on the fossil fuel investment because that's what needs to come down to address emissions. It's really shifted. And I think it's all about that new infrastructure and grid upgrades. I should have mentioned that before. In terms of policy, grid upgrades are
and
critical.
if I can just, on the fossil fuel thing, so Anne quite rightly pointed out that big financial institutions, particular banks, are seen as too big to fail. Fossil fuel is also seen as too big to fail, right? Mm-hmm. What happens is that when the oil price crashes, they go to the government and say, we need some help, and they get the help. Mm-hmm. When the oil price goes through the roof, they make shit tons of money. Yeah. And they don't pay it back, and they lobby against taxes on them. It's basically heads they win, tails we lose, and that continues to be the case. And they're hugely profitable, and yet we subsidise them. So, the UK government, for the expansion in the North Sea, is giving 91 pence in the pound tax relief. I could make money at 91 pence in the pound tax relief doing pretty much anything. Yeah. That we are locked into this mindset of fossil fuel is absolutely necessary, and yet we know that it is also a huge part of the problem.
And just maybe, so just the sort of last part of Donna's question about, it was also about, so I think we would all agree on that, but then we might have more sympathy for the workers in the fossil fuel industry and the communities where they might lose their jobs and where they're based. And maybe this is one for Anne, given your sort of Scottish Just Transition Commission work, but I sort of take it that part of Donna's question was about how do we ensure that some of the finance at least goes into revitalising and new industries in those areas. And then everyone else should be thinking of the next questions. But just a quick one.
Is that a question?
Could you say something about how we get the finance into those particular areas that are the losers from the climate transition?
Right. Well, the problem is we can't rely on the private sector to do that. And it needs a sensible government. It's really difficult with the Scots, actually, because for example, they need to, and it's also very challenging, they need to retrofit their housing. God, if you think our housing is leaky and cold, try and live in colder parts of Scotland or in the Outer Hebrides where we went. And yet there isn't a workforce that can do this because we've deregulated the construction workforce. All construction workers are self-employed. They're all tiny little businesses and they all live very precariously from one little job contract to another. So there isn't the, if you like, the organised labour and trained and skilled labour to do the work. So even if I found the money to retrofit the housing, which apparently costs about £40,000 each, on roughly, that's a lot of money, to find one local authority, South Lanarkshire, is finding that money, without the workforce. So what should happen is government does something which the market won't do, which is to invest in training and upskilling construction workers, making sure they become more skilled and they're better paid and better organised, so that when you hire somebody, when you hire a company to retrofit the housing, there's the plasterer and the electrician, and they can all provide all that you need. It's a block of. I mean, I'm no expert on the construction sector, but I get. I know that they will need a parcel of skills to do this job. But only the public sector will do that investment. And in the case of Scotland, it's really hard for them to raise the finance because the British government, subject to this ideology of austerity, constantly takes money away from public spending, constantly tries to cut public spending. And that's very ideological. It's very ideological because actually, the private sector benefits from public investment always. If you think about HS2, the people that have done really well out of HS2 aren't people like us. They're all the contractors that built HS2 and are not going to finish the end of it. And that's how it should be. The public sector, as Mariana Mazzucato so forcefully argues, should be the roaring lion that takes the risk to invent, for example, the iPhone. And then, dear old Steve Jobs comes along and makes it look pretty. That's what he did. But the work on the internet and on the iPhone was done by an institution that could take the risk, which was the state. So we need to see the state in that sort of constructive role with the private sector, but not just all the time, cut the legs off from. So, I'm waffling a bit here, but this is some of the challenges that poor old Scotland is having to face.
But I mean, just to add quickly, we know that there are huge needs for labour, and we know that people need to switch from areas that either way are going away, right? Like it's just when, not if, right?
Yeah.
So this is going to have to happen. But the other thing is that, we do need to recognize some cultural elements. I'm from an oil and gas producing region of Canada, and it's probably easier to convince someone in the oil and gas sector to go drill holes in the ground for geothermal.
Yes.
And use their skills and respect what they're good at than to get them to install solar panels. And I think that that's the sort of thing that we need to be thinking through. Like, what are things that don't just clang when people hear about it? What jibes socially and culturally with the community at hand?
But you see, our problem on this commission, it was very fascinating being on it. We've got oil rig workers, trade unions representing oil rig workers. We've got oil companies. And then we've got people like me that want to see a green economy and so on, And so I'm having to fight. But the really sad thing is that the oil rig workers are really well paid and they have no trust that we're going to invest in geothermal, or their company will invest in geothermal, so that they'll have an equally skilled job in that sector. So they feel that actually this is a conspiracy to do to them what was done to the miners when Thatcher closed down the mines. And that makes it really hard to make progress. And that causes them to align themselves with their bosses who, say, we've got to keep this industry going. And so these are complex dynamics, political dynamics.
Credibility of public policy, key challenge for political scientists, so students should be thinking about that. Okay, next round of questions, please. So definitely Jonathan, who had his hand up in the previous round. Yep, Camilla, right? Yep, and gentleman at the front.
I guess my kind of question is, like, at the minute, obviously, everywhere's kind of experiencing massive inflation, and here in the UK we've got like cost of living crisis, energy crisis, etc. To me, it seems like the ordinary person, like the financial system, especially like when we're talking trillions of dollars, is just so far away. Like, I mean, in politics, we talk about how people feel so far away from Westminster, for example, in the UN. How do we kind of get the political will within like the ordinary people to kind of push for these investments moving away from fossil fuels, particularly when, you know, like governments are saying there is no money and they can't afford to feed their children, sort of thing? How do we say this is what we should be investing in these massive sums? Like, how do we actually counter that information, sort of thing?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of talk about like how governments should regulate financial markets more, so I just wanted to ask that since there is kind of a nexus between governments and financial markets in terms of this growth-centric mindset, the line has to keep going up and like the economy has to keep growing. So can we really ever reach a sustainable global financial system if we're so focused on being growth-centric, like both governments and the markets?
Thank you. My question was kind of about, you talked about how governments, the importance of governments regulating financial institutions, about how to kind of curb this competition and this making money at all cost. But how do you look at this from a perspective, from an international perspective, where we're living in an increasingly less unipolar world, much more competition, much more division between East and West, and how can you basically alleviate what's going on between competitions between, for example, the US and China?
Yeah.
Because these countries have incentives, geopolitical incentives, to make money and GDP at all cost. So, how do you look at that?
Okay, just given where we are at in time, I'm going to give our speakers each a last opportunity to sort of answer probably only one of those or touch on any of those that they wish in about a minute and a half. So who would like to go first? Yep.
I'm going to just cover two of them. So I do think actually the conversation about inflation could be reshaped to help us in this situation, right? Like, where's the majority of inflation coming from? It's coming from Putin's fossil fuels. Like, honestly, that's how you could rephrase this, right? Like, we're talking about a global market in which Putin is Russia is a top 3 exporter of coal, gas, and oil, and we've got I just feel like there's a conversation here that's not attaching the cause of inflation to where it is. I mean, if we decarbonize, we are taking out a huge element of volatility and inflation from our financial system forever. On the growth mentality, I just want to say one thing, because I feel like Anne will have a better response. But I mean, a cooperative can just go in a steady state for a very long time. I think that's part of the reason I'm so sympathetic to the idea of having a greater diversity of types of institutions in the economy. I grew up surrounded by cooperatives that have stayed about the same size for a very long time. And I think that's an important element of what we need to see.
Yeah. Admirably brief. Thanks, Ellen. Who would like to go next?
Should I go? So I just wanted the question of how do we do that. I mean, for me, education is really important. People have to understand, and people have for a long time thought the most important thing was the weather. They now understand there's something called the climate. And I think in exactly the same way we can say, look, you thought the economy was your local economy. Actually, there's something out there. But it requires us to have a greater understanding of that. And the system would really like to hide what they do. And they use arcane language. They make it sound as complicated and, blah. We've got to get over that. On the question of the South, I think that's really important. I think this is where we're going to get change. So we already have a situation where, first of all, just this last week, Israel has managed to unite Iran, Russia, China, you name it. They're all getting behind, they're all uniting around antipathy towards the United States and Israel. But before that, they began to get really uptight about the dollar and the use of the dollar and the way in which Russia's assets were frozen when she invaded Ukraine. Now, I'm no supporter of Putin's, and I think, we've done everything to boycott what he's doing, but a nation's reserves are a sort of public good. They don't belong to Mr. Putin. They're part of they are the savings and surpluses made by the people of Russia. And it's against international law for any one country to seize the reserves of another's. The United States has both seized Venezuela's reserves and now Russia's. This has really terrified the South. Because if you can do it to Russia, you can do it to me, China, or you can do it to me, India, or you can do it to me, South Africa. Now, I'm South African born, and I'm watching the South Africans more or less line up behind Putin. And that's horrifying to me. But it's mainly because of the way in which the United States has used the power of the dollar against low-income countries. Now, so what I think is they are, and I know they're already beginning to get together. Mia Motley from Barbados is already proposing the Bridgetown Initiative, which is they're talking about a new international financial system. I don't think they get it all right, but the fact is they're having the discussion, we're not having the discussion. So, we may get change through that South Alliance.
Last word falls to you, Tom.
Okay, so I agree with a lot of what you said. I think the BRICS conference this year, the expansion of the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now that lot more countries. There are power shifts there, and if you've got over half of the world's oil producers saying we're going to stop denominating contracts in dollars, then that's a massive threat to the US. So that's interesting. Climate change is inherently inflationary. Okay, so a disaster flies through a country, inflation goes through the roof. A wildfire, inflation goes through the roof. So climate change is inherently inflationary, so that's a problem. So actually, we need to act preemptively. Like we bailed out in 2008, we bailed out COVID. You can't bail out climate change. No one has got enough money. So the need for preemptive action is huge. And I agree with Anne's points on financial education. That is, basically just like governments are terrified of a motivated, well-educated electorate. So's the financial system, particularly because it's not our money. It's all of yours. And that ultimately, so there is this kind of collective responsibility to go and push for these changes. And the financial sector itself, or an enlightened financial sector, has a vested interest in doing that, in actually going and saying to governments, we need change. This is the enabling environment we need to act on behalf of our beneficiaries and our shareholders. So going and advocating for governments, we need these changes, we need this regulation, actually is an enlightened self-interest. And that possibly acting on behalf of everyone whose money it actually is how we get towards a more sustainable financial system.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all we have time for, unfortunately, today. But before we thank our speakers, let me remind you about our next Policy in Practice event, which is entitled The Zelensky Effect, the story of Ukraine through the journey of its president. And that'll be taking place next Thursday, same time, same place in this case. It's not always the same place this term, but next week it will be in here. And you can sign up via our website and Eventbrite. If you don't already, please follow us on Twitter or Instagram. Our handle is UCLSPP. We announce all of our forthcoming events here, and you'll be able to keep up to date with our latest research. So thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking our fantastic speakers.
I feel a bit embarrassed that I have to plug my Substack page. I've got a Substack called System Change. You can subscribe for free, and I write about these system-wide issues there. So I always forget to plug it, so I've been told I have to. Thank you very much.